Hey everyone, welcome back to Coach Hall Writes. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the 2022 AP Lang FRQs. So just as a quick disclaimer, please remember that you cannot discuss any of the multiple choice questions from the exam at any time. Also, please remember that the reactions, views, or opinions that I talk about in this particular video are my own. I do not speak for the College Board. And lastly, and arguably most importantly, especially if you're a student who just took the exam, please remember that there are many ways to answer a prompt correctly. So please don't second guess what you did. Just because I say that my students approached a question a certain way or that I would approach it a certain way doesn't mean that that's the right way. There are many ways to earn a qualifying score. So let's start by talking about the first FRQ, which is the synthesis essay. As far as the pros go for this particular prompt, I like that it's an approachable topic. It seems that the College Board is continuing with the education trend. So last year there was a prompt about cursive. There are also some prompts on AP Classroom that deal with education as well. I like this type of prompt because I think it's very approachable for students, whereas in the past, some of the other topics have been less approachable, things like wind farms or eminent domain. And so with those prompts, students have to really pay attention to the sources to kind of figure out how they feel about that particular topic. Whereas topics like this one, STEM education, is something that students are likely already familiar with, even if they haven't thought about the value of it in the past. Because students likely have personal experience with STEM classes, or they could situate the issue in a broader context, I think this prompt is very approachable, which when you're taking the AP Lang exam is always nice, and as teachers, we like approachable prompts too. Overall, I felt like the sources were very easy to read. There were two graphs as sources, and I felt like they were easy to understand. I also liked that there were 6 sources because while the College Board has said there could be a range of 6 to 8, they seem to be leaning more towards 6, which I think is more doable given the time constraints. In previous prompts, they've included the phrase the role, if any, and in this particular prompt, it had the word value, which I was excited to see because they also use that word in certain Q3 prompts. And my students and I had talked about the value of certain topics quite a lot leading up to the exam. So even though we didn't talk about the value of STEM, I know they were relieved to see a phrase that they were already familiar with. Now, some possible challenges that might occur would be that multiple sources seem to suggest that there needs to be a balance. And I think initially it might have taken students a bit more time to craft a defensible thesis in comparison to some other prompts. However, once students determined their position, I think selecting evidence to support that position would be relatively easy. Something else to keep in mind is that most students like to start with the synthesis essay. Number one, because it's the most time consuming, and number two, because it is the first essay they encounter, even though you can actually answer them in any order. And so, because of this, I think students might have gotten a little bit sidetracked with their timing in some cases. And so, if they spent more time on this particular essay than they had initially budgeted for, then it might have meant that they had to rush through the other essays. I always have my students come up with a tentative game plan for this reason, because you have to remember that you have to write 3 essays and you want to give each one a valiant attempt. And sometimes that means sacrificing a little bit of one in order to get the others done. And so I could see for this one that we might see some unfinished essays. So, for example, we might see some essays without a conclusion, and that's totally okay. But overall, I actually really like this prompt. I do think the phrasing of the actual task might have tripped a couple students up initially, but I think once they got to the sources, things might have been a bit more clear. So overall, this is one that I like, and I do intend to use it in future years. Now for question number 2, rhetorical analysis. This is by far my favorite of the 3 essays, and I did like this particular passage, especially because of the contemporary language. The piece itself was an approachable length, and it was an approachable topic. So even if students weren't familiar with who the speaker was, the College Board provided plenty of information about that. There was a clear rhetorical situation in the prompt. I also appreciated that they included endnotes for clarity. That way, if students were a bit confused about some of the terms or they didn't have a historical reference point for something, they were able to look at those endnotes. I teach my students to analyze a passage chronologically, and I noticed a clear shift in this particular passage, so I appreciated that. I also think that the message is something that students can situate in a broader context. because many students are very familiar with not only the history of America, but also the issues dealing with diversity and how it is still an issue today. So I think there's a lot of different possibilities that students could have used in order to situate the issue in a broader context, either in their intro or perhaps their conclusion, or maybe even throughout the body paragraphs. Now let's talk about some of the challenges. As I was reading this particular prompt and annotating it myself, I realized that I think some students are going to have some trouble identifying clear rhetorical choices or even her message. I think her message becomes more pronounced in the second half of the speech after that shift. But one of the tips I have for students that I'm really going to emphasize even more next year is that you don't always have to know the exact name for a rhetorical choice. You have to be able to answer the question, what is the speaker doing? And so, as I was thinking about the different choices I noticed in the speech, things like definition, I also realized that if I were writing this as a student, it might have been easier for me to use strong verbs and not be bogged down with choices or devices as much. So, that what is she doing question would have really helped me if I was a student trying to read this for the exam. Something else that students need to consider is that the prompt asks about the message. And so students would really need to zero in on what the message is. And I think you need to look at the entirety of the passage to really figure that out. Usually, I'm the type of person that looks for choices first and then connects them to the message. But for this one, if I was taking it on the exam, I might have actually worked backwards. I might have actually figured out what her message was first and then figured out how she actually made choices to create that message. I think either approach works. I just typically don't do it that way. But for this particular prompt, somehow that backwards thinking kind of worked. I think timing is an issue for all three essays on the exam. And so, because of that, I think there might have been several students who might not have had the time to really delve into the historical or present day implications of the message. One of the skills that I talked about this year with my own students was really trying to figure out the historical context or the implications of the message today. And while I did remind them about this leading up to the exam, I'm not so sure how many actually were able to articulate that as well as they would have liked to, simply because I think they felt like they ran out of time. And that's totally okay, because remember, these essays are viewed as rough drafts. However, it did emphasize to me as a teacher that I want to really go over that skill as well next year to hopefully have it become even more second nature. That way, students are able to situate the issue in a broader context a bit more easily. Another thing that I noticed was that even though the prompt gave plenty of background information, I'm wondering if students might have struggled to use that background information to their advantage. And again, that might have been a timing issue or it might have just been the pressure of exam day. But I do like this particular prompt and I would definitely use this in future years. I think it could connect really easily to a unit about identity, and it would be a great way to add in some different voices to that type of unit as well. And now for my least favorite of the essays. I tend to prefer synthesis and rhetorical analysis over argument anyway, but this particular prompt is one that I think is definitely a bit intimidating for students. I don't think it's a bad prompt by any means, but if I were to rank the Q3 prompts from the last 10 years, I don't think this prompt would make the top 5. Certainly not if I'm ranking by approachability. But here are the pros that I've noticed. I think that if students use an acronym like CHORES or ReHugo, there are other acronyms as well. I think an acronym like that could really help students during the planning phase for this particular prompt because students might not have had ideas of evidence right away. And so using an acronym like CHORES or ReHugo could have really helped students organize their ideas. Also, for this particular prompt, if students wanted to address the counter argument, I think this prompt allows for that to happen more so than some of the other prompts. Now, keep in mind that you do not need to address the counter argument. In fact, you should really only do so if it's going to help your argument. But I do think that some students will have taken advantage of that argumentation skill in their essays. Now, the possible challenges with this particular prompt, I think brainstorming quality specific evidence might have taken longer than expected. I had one student tell me today in class, now that we can actually talk about these prompts since they're publicly available, that she went with the evidence that she could argue best in the time that she had remaining, but it wasn't necessarily the evidence she would have used had she had more time. She said she had to make the choice between brainstorming more or just going with an example that she could use to prove her point. And so she made a decision in the moment, which weirdly sort of relates to the prompt, I guess. So, as far as different types of evidence that students used, I think students who were in some kind of like American history class or world history class, I think they could have used historical evidence for this. Maybe things like the Articles of Confederation or even Hamilton. They would need to narrow it down a little bit more, but I could see students talking about World War I or World War II. One of my students told me that he wrote about the Chinese Navy in the 1400s. I had him explain it to me earlier today, and it was actually a really compelling example. So I think there's a lot that students can do with both history and current events for this particular prompt. I also think this prompt lends itself to personal experience as long as students are able to actually connect it to a meaningful lesson. Something else that might have been a possible challenge is that I don't think students would have necessarily thought to distinguish between quickly and timely, especially in their planning. If they had, I think that would have made the planning and writing process a little bit easier. So, one of the things that I've made a note about is to remind my students to define these abstract terms in their essays. It was something that we covered in class, but I don't think I reminded them to do this before the exam. So, I'm not sure if they really did that or to what degree they did that. But moving forward, this prompt is a great example of why it's important to set those parameters. I think if students were to do that, it could lead to a more nuanced argument. And ultimately, it could make selecting the evidence a bit easier. Due to the complexity of the topic, I bet a lot of students felt really rushed with this essay, especially if it was their last essay. So those are my reactions to the 2022 FRQ prompts. If you are a teacher or a student, let me know your reactions in the comments below. Just please be respectful. And as always, if you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and make sure that you are subscribed here on YouTube, and go ahead and give me a follow on TikTok as well. Until next time, happy writing.